So move to strike the last word.
For what purpose does Ms. Deming seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The lady's recognized.
Let me just say.
Classified documents and actively work to undermine the lawful discharge of the President's duties under Article 2. If their judgment can replace that of the President, it means that the people of the United States have simply been removed from the equation. Now, someone said during the discussion today that the President has actually committed real crimes. The article does not charge such crimes. Why not? Because there's no evidence to support them. If there was evidence, you know that in a heartbeat they would have included these charges, so it's obvious they don't even believe their own rhetoric. One member said, we're not restricted as the Department of Justice is. Think about what that statement means. The Department of Justice is restricted by the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights sets forth basic principles of due process, the right to confront your accuser, the right to call witnesses in your defense. Charges have to be supported by evidence, not gossip, and you have the right to appeal to the courts to protect these rights. Yes, the Department of Justice is restricted by the Bill of Rights, but our Bill of Rights, with its due process restrictions, restricts all of us who take the oath of office, and that includes Congress. We are restricted to respect these rights also. Only the majority is now placing themselves above the supreme law of the land. The lawful exercise of executive power is simply not an impeachable offense. The President is responsible for faithfully executing the laws. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes it a crime to offer something of value to secure business in a foreign country. Well, the facts of Mr. Biden's actions in the Ukraine certainly look like they crossed that line. Does the President have the authority to request cooperation of a foreign government to investigate potentially corrupt interactions between U.S. officials and their own officials? Of course he does. The Democrats impute the most sinister motives to this request. Well, nothing in the conversation suggests that. Do us a favor because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. That's the exact quote. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act specifically requires the administration to determine that Ukraine is taking steps to combat corruption before aid can be released. Now, the Democrats have made much of the fact that the Secretary of Defense certified this in May. They ignore two facts. Number one, the Secretary of Defense exercises no authority independent of the President. The buck still stops at the President's desk. And two, the President retains responsibility to determine that the findings of his administration remain valid, particularly as he assesses the intention of a newly elected President and newly elected Parliament. And lest we forget, last year, 3 Democratic senators wrote to the Ukrainian government demanding that it cooperate in investigating President Trump. The Democrats found absolutely nothing objectionable about this. The only difference I see is that the President actually has the authority and the responsibility to make such a request. So what's at stake here? The worst possible interpretations of the President's motives in discharging his constitutional powers are being imputed to him by his most vitriolic opponents. Now, there's nothing extraordinary about that. It's called politics. But if this can become the new standard of impeachment, that Congress can impeach any president whose motives his opponents question, if this is allowed to replace treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors as the standard for nullifying a national election and substituting the judgment of Congress instead of the judgment of the American people, well, then no president can make any decision without subjecting the nation to the travesty going on today. The executive branch will be subordinated to the legislative, serving at the pleasure of Congress, and the separation of powers at the heart of our Constitution will have been utterly destroyed. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose is recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we went through this amendment, which I think is probably one of the most telling amendments, and when put to a vote is going to tell a lot, because this is the most amorphous amendment that you could have. This is the one that even when I was waiting for the announcement from the chairman and others at the podium. I was actually there and was being interviewed. And when I heard this one come up and confirm that abuse of power was one of their articles of impeachment, it was simply stunning. And my first reaction has been made and rung true completely here today by many of the members on the majority, including the gentleman from Tennessee just recently, who just confirmed it. Abuse of power for article of impeachment means anything they want it to mean. It is the carte blanche coverage. It's saying, we don't really have a case to our caucus, but go out and make it up. Just go out and say what you don't like. If you didn't say something nice to this, if you didn't do a policy you don't like, do this and that's going to cover you. You'll be okay. Because remember, this is always about an election. You know how we continue to know this? We keep misquoting the transcript. They don't have the facts, so we keep misquoting the transcript, saying, do me a favor. Again, it's simple. Read it. It's us, our country. I mean, if you've got a case, make it, but don't make it up because you don't have it. What we have here also is this continual, just repeated attacks on the Ukrainian President, Mr. Zelensky. The repeated attacks. Because we're either claiming he is a liar or a puppet, or as we just called, he's a politician and an actor, so disregard him. Wow, that's a lot of concern for the Ukrainian people, taking on their very president they've just elected. When we understand and we look at this, this is how it gets to the problem. When you get to a certain point and you can't make your case, when you can't factually add it up, when you have law school professor tell you, well, if you think this, then the inference is okay, then we've lowered the standard to where anything can be brought in. The factual case that has just been made over the past almost 3 hours now by the minority side has laid bare the case on abuse of power. There is none. You can make it up, you can call it whatever you want, and you can go try and sell that to the American people, but they're not buying it. They're not. And it's going to get harder and harder for members to actually go to that well next week, or go to that ballot where they actually stick their card in and vote yes on abuse of power, and then actually have to go back and explain that. It's easy in this room. You got help from your colleagues, but when you're back home trying to explain why you're going to take down a president duly elected over abuse of power because of some of the arguments we've heard this morning, that's just amazing. There is true skepticism about what went on in the Ukraine, and it's deeply rooted with this president. And by the way, there was another time in the late 17 and early 18, Ukraine aid was held. It's not the first time. Skeptical of foreign aid. He ran on this. I've said this before. Most people are amazed that he actually does what he said he's going to do. He runs on campaign that our foreign aid needs to be looked at. He actually does those kind of things. That's what a president and shows true leadership does. The pause was for 55 days. Also, other countries' aid was also held. Lebanon was actually held. Others were actually held. This is not a new thing. Do not let the majority try to convince the American people that withholding aid or not looking into corruption is a new thing. Don't let them do it. In the words, like I said, others, maybe that's what, when you're having to play a part, you have to do that. You have to make it up. It's called ad lib, and that's what they're doing. Mr. Hale testified, one of the more egregious ones, and I have a friend of mine who texted me just a few minutes ago. Mr. Stooges brought this up, I brought this up, but again, it needs to be hit. One of the things perpetrated this morning out to the American people is that people lost their lives in the Ukraine over this held aid. This friend of mine who texted me just a few minutes ago lost limbs on his own body in defense of our country in a war zone. And he says, don't let them get away with this because this is a future act. Mr. Hale testified to this fact. In fact, he repeated it in his deposition. We want to talk about facts? Go to the deposition. Go to the transcript that he had. He said this was future aid, had nothing to do with running the army right then. In war zones, people get hurt and people die, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. They are fighting that. It is a hot war. People will. But to blame this conversation because you have such a weak case that you're going to try and throw that in just to scare the American people, that's not right. Make a case, have your facts, put it in the articles. But when you can't do that, you go in the back room, you start writing articles of impeachment, and you say, uh-oh, we got a problem. Let's put something in there that all of our conference can get behind because they don't like the president. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to speak in opposition to this amendment. and to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to remind you of the facts that have been uncovered and to review them and put them on the record again for the American public, because facts do matter. Notice the contrast between the conversation on this side of the aisle and that. They run away from the facts. They're afraid to admit to themselves or to the American public of what the president's behavior really adds up to. So